And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston, and with me tonight is Daniel Rogers. William is not with us, and so glad to have Daniel with us. We're going to continue our discussion of the Messianic Temple here in just a little bit. Daniel, I think folks know you to a certain extent, but tell us anyway, give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and what's been going on in your world lately.
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Alabama. I had moved down to Florida for a couple of years to work at a congregation in Arcadia, just southeast of Tampa. But recently, my wife and I both got job offers again in North Alabama, and so we're kind of back in our old stomping ground, so to speak. And I'm working as a co-minister of a church up here in North Alabama and in Albertville called the North Broad Street Church of Christ. They're not a full preterist church, so to speak, but they know my position, and they're happy with me being here, working with the youth, and also attending school while I come here. And so I've got a website that I post on pretty frequently called labornotinvain.com. And once we get moved in and settled, I'm going to be resuming a lot of my live streams and YouTube work that you're probably used to me doing if you follow my channel or my website at all. So that's what's been going on, Don.
All right, very good. Well, I know that a lot of our listeners are, in fact, very familiar with you. You've been kind enough to fill in for me on my morning musings somewhat in the past, and I had actually contacted you a little bit ago to try to fill in for me, or I thought about it, getting you to do that since I have been on a hiatus from filming the last 2 weeks to try to give my voice a little bit of a rest. I caught strep throat a little over 2 months ago. Evidently, the strep throat settled in my larynx, and evidently it did some damage to my vocal cords. I don't know how much people can tell now, but it is still a strain for me to talk. It is a strain for me to project and to have any volume. I very often go into coughing spasms, not always. I told my wife before I came on the air that I really, really, really hope that I won't go into coughing, that I'll be able to talk on the program tonight. But I can tell you this, it is good to be back here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And I miss doing my morning musings. And I tell you, I'm just thrilled to death with the job that Scott Fisher has been doing. My friend, he's from Tennessee, and he's been doing a fantastic job doing and filling in for my morning musing segment there, and been doing some teaching from the book of Hebrews. And I've just gotten a ton of really, really positive feedback on the lessons that Scott has been presenting. So again, I'm thrilled to be able to be back just tonight. We'll see how this goes. At the moment, at this present moment, my voice feels internally, it feels extremely, extremely tight and uncomfortable. But again, we're going to do the very best that we can, and we're going to carry right on. I tell you what, this 2-week hiatus, I have, to a great extent, I have taken somewhat of a break from Facebook. Now, I would post Scott Fisher's videos every morning on the various websites or Facebook pages that I normally post my morning musing videos on. And other than that, I just didn't get on Facebook a tremendous amount. As a matter of fact, while I was in Springfield, Missouri over this last weekend, my wife and I went up there, as I was sharing with Daniel before we came on the air. My wife and I went to Springfield, Missouri over the weekend and attended what is generally considered to be the largest automotive swap meet in Missouri, and had a fantastic time. And, with the exception of being on Facebook for just a few moments for a couple of the days, I really didn't spend a whole lot of time on Facebook, and I certainly did not spend a lot of time on the Facebook pages that are basically dedicated to attacking any kind of preterist as a heretic, false teacher, man of sin, et cetera. Pardon me. And that was kind of refreshing, Daniel. It really was. I went there for 2 or 3 days and wasn't called a heretic a single time, with that very, very brief exceptions for a morning or two there on the one Facebook page. So it was like, whoa, this is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's with the new baby, he's 19 months old now, so I don't know if you can call it new anymore. But with how everything with COVID was working out, I had to stay home with him for a while because Laura was the school teacher, and they her job resumed, but my job, which was basically business to business, door to door copier sales, I had to stop doing that because of COVID, and so
sure.
I stayed home with the baby, and she went back to work teaching, and I just did not have time to get on Facebook, and it would just stress me out because I didn't have the time to dedicate to responding to all of the critics, and so I had to end up leaving a lot of those groups that I used to be at least somewhat active in, and it has been refreshing,
Yeah.
having people breathing down your neck about every little thing you do has been nice. So,
well. Growing up in Arkansas, there were a couple of sayings, colloquial, localized statements. I think they're also in some other states, but I shared with some people some time ago that one of the sayings that we had in Arkansas was, "You don't stop a train to throw rocks at a barking dog," and I have gotten to the point where, although I will engage the critics, especially if I think that they're saying anything that needs to be responded to. And I must confess, I get a little chippy at times. And I recently told some of the people on that one Facebook page that they were talking about me not being on there somewhat. And I told them, I said, well, guys, you have to understand. I said, the only reason I come on this Facebook page anyway is to have some fun refuting your nonsense. And I said, secondly, I've got honest people to deal with. Thirdly, I've got a whole lot more important things to deal with than the nonsense that you guys post. So I said, just because I don't show up here for a period of time doesn't mean one thing. It certainly doesn't mean that I'm scared of you, that I can't answer you. It means that I've got more important things to deal with. And that didn't go over real well, since so many of them on there, if you don't respond within the time frame that they think you ought to, then that proves that you're running scared and all this kind of stuff. And the second old saying that we had in Arkansas is, you don't get into a puking contest with a buzzard. Now, that's kind of a crass saying, but
yes,
the ungodliness that is manifested on one of those Facebook pages particularly. I told one of the men on there yesterday, and he wrote what was absolutely one of the most horrid, slanderous, false, ungodly comments in an attack on me. And I told him, I said, I said, from time to time, I keep wondering if you can sink any lower in your ungodly attacks, slanderous, false attacks on me. And I said, then lo and behold, you do. You sink lower than you ever have. And I said, honestly, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. I said, I thought this was supposed to be a forum for discussing issues. Instead, you've turned it into a forum for you to publicly attack my character, my integrity, my standing before the Lord, and to do nothing but call me names. I said, you don't make any biblical arguments. All you do is slander me. And again, I said, you really honestly ought to be ashamed of yourself. Well, of course, that elicited a response. You're the one that ought to be ashamed of yourself and repenting of your sin for teaching such an ungodly doctrine as preterism. So, that's that's the kind of things that we encounter when we try to deal with people who have hardened their hearts. They become willfully and willingly ignorant. They have turned their back on the truth, and that's all you can say about it. And some of them have become so calloused, and they have become guilty of literally creating brand spanking new arguments that have never been made in the history of biblical commentary. Some of the most asinine, ridiculous, illogical, and unscriptural, not to mention unscholarly, arguments that a person has, that you've ever heard of. And, I try to think that I've done a fair amount of reading. I'm fairly familiar with the scholarly literature that is out there. I certainly haven't read everything. I don't make a claim to that. I don't think anyone can read all of it. But when somebody comes up with some of the arguments that some of these individuals are making, and you know that all of the very top scholars that you have read and who allude to other top scholars, perhaps some of whom you have not read, and not one of them even hints, suggests, infers, or implies anything remotely resembling what is being argued, then you just sit back and you just shake your head in wonderment at the desperation of the anti-preterist sentiment. And as part of why I coined this non-Latin Latin phrase, argumentum ad desperatum. Now, that's not in the Latin. It's just a term that Don Preston invented, but it means argument from desperation. And that's what I mean when I encounter arguments that I've just described. When you can't find those arguments made in any literature by any commentator of any religious affiliation, it's not to be found. And when you call on them, when you challenge them, as I did today, and I did yesterday, I challenged them to document from any lexicon, from any grammatical source, or from any critical scholarship, where any scholar, any grammar, any lexicon supports what they're saying. And when all they do is ridicule me for challenging them, it's more than a little bit revealing. And that's why I say it's argumentum ad desperatum.
Well, that's sometimes what you run into. I've had similar experiences in the past where you'll have heard something preached over and over and over again, like in the Church of the Christ, for example. And then the person that you've been talking to comes back with just something that you have never heard. You might have even heard taught against, Yeah. And you're going, where did this come from? And the only solution that you can think of is, well, they must have just had to, come up with this to save their skin. The example I'm thinking of is I was always taught an early date of Revelation. We took the Foy Wallace view and had learned from Franklin Camp and all this. And one day I was talking to somebody about that who knows all those arguments very well. And they walked me up to a classroom in the church building, to the upstairs, opened up a door. They pointed at the wall where the books of the Bible were listed on a little chart that you can get, from a Christian publishing company.
Yeah.
And they pointed at it and they said, look right there, Revelation, AD 96.
Well, look, okay, we're all going to have to repent now. That's it. That's definitive, right?
Yep, that's right. And one time, in that same classroom, up on the whiteboard, I saw that there was one of the Bible class teachers had listed some passages about the second coming. And you know what two were right next to each other as parallels? Matthew 24:31 and 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yes,
and I'm just
going,
oh man, this is I've been trying to tell you, but oh well.
Yeah. Right. Well, listen, we want to get to our study of the Messianic Temple. I was reading just the other day. Somebody sent me a link. I've lost it now. But the individual, it was on somebody else's Facebook, or I should say YouTube channel, and I had responded to the original poster, and again, it was about the Messianic Temple, saying, and I just pointed out, there will be no temple built in Jerusalem, and even if there were, it would not be the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Oh my goodness. This individual responded to me, and and they just, of course, I'm actually a heretic for denying their dispensational doctrine. But they said they're getting ready to build and to begin construction of the temple this was their terminology, any day now. And I was rather stunned at that. And I thought, well, I wonder what the Muslims think about this. I didn't realize that the Dome of the Rock, had been removed. I didn't realize that the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem had okayed such a thing. I am aware of the fact that as many as, and this fluctuates from time to time, there have been, and there are, and again it fluctuates, as many as 10 attempts every single year by Jewish Zionist radicals to break into the precincts of the Dome of the Rock to blow it up so that the Jerusalem temple can be rebuilt. A lot of people are not familiar with that, but all a person has to do is to do some research, and you know that very, very commonly some Zionist radicals do their best to destroy the Dome of the Rock. And a former general in the Israeli army, he is a raving radical Zionist, and he is on record as saying, we need World War III so that the Dome of the Rock can be destroyed and we can build our temple. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this means that the subject of the Messianic Temple is incredibly relevant. It means it is incredibly important because Zionists in America, and that includes John Hagee, who is a radical Zionist. He is on record saying Christians should not even try to convert Jews because after all, the Jews have their own covenant. It's the Abrahamic covenant. They don't need Jesus. And if we are naive enough to believe and to think the subject of the Messianic Temple is simply an exercise in biblical doctrine, kind of an abstract, pie-in-the-sky theological exercise, we are flat dead wrong. This is a subject that is on the minds of literally millions and millions and millions of people every day. It is a subject that is the cause of violence very, very commonly. And so that's why William and I started out, and Daniel and I are going to continue here for a bit, why the subject of the Messianic Temple is so critically important. And Daniel, today when I spoke to you, I asked what passage on the Messianic Temple you'd like to discuss, and you suggested John chapter 4. Why don't you give us a real brief synopsis of how John chapter 4 of the Samaritan woman fits into this story of the Messianic Temple?
Sure, of course. Well, one thing that's interesting is you mentioned a moment ago how the YouTube commenter said that the temple was ready to be built any day now. And the Anchor Yale Bible commentary which was written by Raymond Edward Brown. He made this comment on John chapter 2 when Jesus used the expression, he'd build it again in 3 days. He says, and this is, of course, his interpretation, but he says, perhaps the best solution regarding the 3 days lies in recognizing that 3 days was an expression that meant a short but indefinite time. He cites a few examples. He says, by promising that the Messianic Temple would be rebuilt in such a short time, Jesus may have been hinting at its miraculous nature. His point was that Jesus's comment that it would be rebuilt in 3 days meant that it would be built in a short time. Regardless of how you would interpret that, it's impossible to find the fulfillment of Jesus's words outside of his generation. So yeah. I thought I'd bring that up because that's what that reminded me of when I was doing some research earlier for this lesson tonight. But what we have in John chapter 4 is really a continuation of what's been going on throughout the Gospel of John, beginning in John chapter 1. Because in John chapter 1, with the introduction of John the Baptist, of course, Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3 is cited as he being the one that was the voice crying in the wilderness. He's the fulfillment of the Elijah passages in Malachi 3 and 4. And he was the forerunner of not just Jesus' so-called first coming versus his second coming, but his entire parousia, the first and the second coming, his coming to die on the cross and his coming in judgment. And what we have in chapters 2 and 3 are some introductions into that. Of course, when Jesus turns water into wine, that might remind us of Isaiah chapter 1, where their wine had become diluted with water, talking about their coming judgment there in Isaiah 1. They had become like Sodom. In chapter 2, of course, Jesus makes the comment about the Messianic Temple, and as the exegetical dictionary of the New Testament talks about, Jesus using that term to build up or to raise up really connects the Messianic Temple with his resurrection, but it also connects it with the church, the ecclesia. And then in chapter 3 with Nicodemus and the new birth, this again hints back, being born of water and spirit hints back to passages like Ezekiel 36 and similar texts where they would be washed with water and living waters would flow. And so when we come to John chapter 4, we find Jesus having this conversation with the woman at the well, the product of the divided empire, divided kingdom all the way back in the days of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And when he goes and he asks her to give him a drink, and they have their dialogue there, and she wants to know how he can ask her for a drink, being a Jew. And John sort of clarifies there the cultural situation, that Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans. She goes on, and when she realizes that Jesus must be at least a prophet, maybe even the Messiah, she asks a question. And I think, Don, you can agree with me here that we probably have a question that we're ready to ask Paul, when we get to heaven. There's some Bible verse or, prophecy that he quoted or something that you're just ready to ask. And this woman had this question on her mind. And the question was basically, where's the right place to worship, here on this mountain or in Jerusalem? Now, to us, that might seem like a silly question. But this was her entire world. Where do we worship? You people say that it's supposed to be in Jerusalem. Our fathers worshiped in this mountain. Please, clear this situation up for me. So the expectation of the Messianic expectations were intense, as we see in the first few chapters of the book of Luke, not just among the Jews, but among the Samaritans as well. And what both groups were really looking for was justification. That their way was the right way, but also reconciliation to God. And so Jesus offering her the eternal water of life, as we see in around about verse 14, that's going to pull from all these Old Testament passages, really ultimately going back to God watering the people and during the Exodus, that would hint that Jesus was, aware of some sort of new Exodus or second Exodus that was going on or just about to take place. And so she latches onto that very quickly and recognizes his authority and the importance of him appearing to the Samaritan people. So hopefully that was a good enough introduction there for you, Don.
Well, that's very rich and some really, really good insights. And I think it's extremely important that we do, as you pointed out there a moment ago, that we recognize that John chapter 4 doesn't stand alone. There's a thread throughout the book of John. And by the way, there is an Australian scholar by the name of Mary Coloe, Coloe, is how she spells her names. And she has written a book on the temple, the Messianic Temple, in the book of John. Now, obviously, she's a Catholic scholar. There's a great deal that in the book that I would not agree with on any level, of course. But nonetheless, in spite of that, she develops and discusses and really has some fantastic insight how temple imagery permeates the book of John. And by the way, she's not alone in that. There's several quite scholarly books out right now, and that have been produced over the last probably 10 to 15 years on demonstrating how powerfully temple imagery, temple language permeates the book of John. And by the way, we have, even before, you had mentioned picking up there in John chapter 2 and what have you, but in John chapter 1, we have temple language imagery, Messianic temple imagery that is expressed in a very powerful, although very succinct way. The Word became flesh and dwelt, pardon me, tabernacled, from the Greek word skene, tabernacled among men. Well, that brings out something you touched on there a moment ago, and that is the Exodus. Because nothing conjured up imagery of Exodus in the Jewish mind more than skene, that word, because it was the tabernacle that they built while they were wandering in the wilderness, Exodus 25 to 40. And so God repeatedly said in those chapters, again, Exodus 25 to 40, God repeatedly said, "This is where I will meet you. I will dwell among you. This is where I will dwell." Now, so obviously it was representatively, but that temple did represent the presence of God. And so now here we have John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And the Word, when it says the Word was with God, that language there means on a face-to-face basis. There's an equality that is expressed in that language of being with God. He was not the God, he was God, not the God. In other words, he wasn't the Father, but he was nonetheless God. He was true deity. And then immediately he came, we are told. That Word became flesh, and he came and tabernacled. Just like Yahweh came to be with Israel, dwelling with them in the tabernacle, here is Jesus, who is Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and following us say, who is the very express of God, and the fullness of his glory, he came and tabernacled among men. So once again, this temple imagery, and obviously this is messianic, so we find this theme, this motif of the Messianic Temple beginning directly here in John chapter 1. And by the way, you mentioned a really excellent point there about Jesus turning the water to wine and going back to Isaiah chapter 1. That to me is just a really, really excellent tie-in. It is one that scholars have recognized. And there's something else at work here. When Jesus turns water to wine, and then in chapter 4, he tells this woman that if you believe in me, those who believe in me out of their belly shall flow waters of, or living waters. And if you believe in me, I will give you water, and you will never thirst again. Well, folks, this goes directly back to Ezekiel chapter 40 to 47 that William and I spent so much time on. In Ezekiel 46, 47, chapter 47 specifically, out of that Messianic temple, what flows? River of life. And everywhere it flowed, it gave life, except in some areas. It didn't flow in some regions, and where it did not flow, there was no life. So here is this promise of the river of life flowing, and it would flow out of the temple. And then in Zechariah chapter 14, in the prediction of the day of the Lord against Jerusalem, what do we find? Well, find a river of life flowing out from the temple of God and watering the world, so to speak. And so Jesus is really drawing on, I think it was John A.T. Robinson, who, Pistache, which means just a combination of Old Testament prophecies. He didn't say, if you believe in me, I'll give you water and you'll never thirst again, in fulfillment of Ezekiel, or in Ezekiel to Zechariah, or in fulfillment of Isaiah 12, verse 3, let us with joy draw waters from the salvation. No, he didn't say that. But I tell you what, folks, to me this is illustrative. I will say this. It is illustrative of how ignorant I personally was in my early years, in my early ministry. I was so ignorant of the Old Testament that I literally had no clue when I was reading so many New Testament passages that these New Testament passages, these New Testament speeches that are recorded, were in fact directly echoing a host of Old Testament prophecies. And, just recently I was reading one former preterist who was trying to negate covenant eschatology. And in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, when Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, whosoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And this individual was saying, well, see, the formula that Matthew uses, Matthew's favorite formula is that it might be fulfilled, which was written by, and then, alludes to or cites the Old Testament passage. And so this individual was saying, see, Matthew doesn't use that formula that it might be fulfilled. Well, that's creating a really, really false journalistic rule. Good grief. Who has a right to say that a prophecy or an Old Testament text could only be a prophecy being fulfilled if the New Testament writer says, guess what? This is the fulfillment. And as a matter of fact, it can be demonstrated quite easily that Matthew cites several, and I mean several, Old Testament passages, and in those passages that he cites, when he is writing, he does not say that it might be fulfilled, which was written or spoken by the prophets. But what he is doing, it's so abundantly clear that that's precisely what he is doing. And so he didn't have to say, well, what happened here is in the fulfillment of. No. Number one, that's denying the normal way of or I should say, the normal hermeneutic, Hebraic hermeneutic. They did not believe. They did not teach. They did not say, well, it has to be said, this happened that it might be fulfilled. No, no, no. That is simply not the way things were done and said. Now, by the way, I'm trying to remember now exactly which one of my books I document this in. I have a list of passages in Matthew, and I didn't even examine Mark, Luke, John, but I focused on Matthew. But I adduced a list of passages in Matthew in which Matthew simply said, as it is written. He didn't say that it might be fulfilled, which was written. He just simply said, as the prophet said, or as it is written. And yet there's absolutely no denying that in the context and the way that he's using it, he is saying, he is teaching that whatever it is he's talking about, it was the fulfillment of what the Old Testament prophet that he cites that passage was being fulfilled. So when we come to John and we see Jesus using the language of living waters, even though he never says, I'm going to do this or you're going to receive this in order that it might be fulfilled, which was written in Ezekiel 47, which they didn't have chapters, divisions, or this, I'm offering you this in fulfillment of what Isaiah promised or Ezekiel or whatever. No. It's just simply not the way they did things. So it's a completely artificial, contrived, and invented hermeneutic to demand that any New Testament writer had to say, such and such happened that it might be fulfilled. This is the fulfillment of. No, they didn't have to do that. No Jew of the first century would expect or demand that type of thing. And, folks, if you haven't read, I was talking with our mutual friend Dallas Burdett the other day about this very thing and about when I was growing up, as I mentioned a few moments ago, I was so ignorant, so utterly ignorant of how the New Testament used the Old Testament, that when I began to see how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, is dependent on the Old Testament. Now, you talk about a shock to my system, folks. I mean, that made my head turn around on my shoulders. I mean, it just blew my mind. In later years, I discovered the writings of a man by the name of Richard Hayes. Now, if you have not discovered or have not read the books of Richard Hayes, I would highly recommend that you do so. Richard Hayes wrote a book, Echoes of Scripture in Paul, and Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels. And I have to tell you, this latter book, and I was sharing this with Dr. Dallas Burdett in a phone call the other day. I don't think he was quite familiar with Echoes of Scripture in the Gospel. It seemed like he wasn't. I know he knows of Richard Hayes and of his writings. But that latter work, Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels, is one of the most evocative, rich, I would even use the word warm books. And by that I mean, it just gave me the warm fuzzies. When I read and when I read that, I'll pick it up at every once in a while, just reread sections of it. And I just marvel of how wonderfully rich the Gospels truly are. And he focuses a great deal on the Gospel of Mark, which in scholarly circles is considered to be the very first of the Gospels written, and the others are dependent on them. So that's why scholars generally appeal to Mark instead of the others first. But I got to tell you, folks, when we read John chapter 4 and Jesus' discussion, the woman's discussion of living water, we really, really, really ought to acquaint ourselves of the Old Testament promises of how inextricably bound up the motif of water, living water, flowing out of Jerusalem, flowing out of the Messianic Temple, how rich of a subject that truly is. And I've talked a good bit there, Daniel, so go ahead and jump right in there and offer us some additional thoughts.
Sure. When you look at the connections you were mentioning a while ago with Ezekiel 47 and Isaiah 12 and similar texts, you also can't help but, Zechariah 14, you can't help but think about Revelation chapter 21 as well, Revelation 21 and 22, which takes all of those passages again and just fits them all together so perfectly. And when you take what Revelation has to say about the fall of the temple in Revelation chapter 11 and the holy place being opened up and everything related to that, all the temple imagery was there, that's there in the few verses of Revelation 21. And you compare that to Jesus's our statements of John chapter 4. It's impossible to see for me Revelation as being as having a future fulfillment. When you take all that he says there, compare it to John's Jesus's our statements in John chapter 4, then it's just really hard to separate the two. I think you'd agree there, because what Jesus basically says in answer to her in John chapter 4 is this: an hour is coming, and now is, when neither an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. And I always used to think that was just talking about the end of the law of Moses and the establishment of the church and all this sort of stuff. But really what he's saying is it was going to be physically impossible for them to worship in this mountain or in Jerusalem, because the Roman army was just going to come through and burn the whole place to the ground.
Absolutely.
And then what he says in verse 23 is, but an hour is coming and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. And so what you have is really the inauguration of this new covenant temple, Jesus being the cornerstone and the Christians being built up as spiritual stones, as we see in 1 Peter chapter 2. And you have the completion of it with the destruction of Jerusalem and the conquest of that whole area by the Roman military in the 60s and in the year 70. And so this all correlates very well, very cleanly with Revelation 11, which talks about the holy place being tread underfoot for 42 months, and then the new tabernacle being established in Revelation chapter 21, the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And one thing that I was talking to Don about a little bit on the phone earlier is this idea of worshiping in spirit and in truth. We kind of use this passage as a proof text in the churches of Christ to say that you have to have the right attitude and you have to do it the right way. But if you understand the question that she's asking, which is where are we to worship, then the answer that he gives isn't about means and methods. It's about a location. In spirit and in truth is not about where you worship in the sense of in an assembly on the first day of the week doing 5 prescribed acts, but it's about the fact that we are the temple of God, that when we are living our lives as Christians, our entire life is a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is our spiritual service of worship, as the New American Standard renders it in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And what's interesting is when Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, and if we were to go to 1 and 2 Corinthians to talk about the Messianic Temple, that would probably take, well, if you spent 14 episodes in John chapter 2, I'm assuming that going to 1 and 2 Corinthians would take about 60 episodes or more.
Yeah, yeah.
But, one of the very first things that Paul does in 1 Corinthians in verse 3 is he's talking to the saints there, and he says that in every place they called on the name of the Lord, which brings me in my mind back to the temple, because in the dedication of the temple, all the way back in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 6, around verse 30 and following, Solomon said that the foreigners would come from all places to go to this place to call on the name of the Lord in this place. And so already what you have in Paul's language in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 is this idea of them calling on the name of the Lord in every place, which hints at the idea that the transition from this physical place that a person can go to and argue about which one's right has already begun to transition into a spiritual concept, something where someone can literally pray without ceasing. Because as we live and serve in this new covenant temple as priests in God's kingdom, we quite literally are praying without ceasing. We're always before God in the holy place. And this is really the type of face-to-face relationship that Jesus has brought us into with God. And I think if more Christians have understood that, a lot of the bickering and fighting that we have over the means and methods of worship in a Sunday morning assembly begin to very quickly dissolve, because nothing that we do on Sunday morning can compare to the communion that we have with God on a daily basis, right?
Yeah, and to build on what you said there, and that's all excellent, but this concept, as you noted, where Paul says in every place, that terminology, this is another good example of the echo of Scripture that I was mentioning a while ago. And let's take a step back and consider how revolutionary Jesus' words truly were. As you mentioned there, and let's give a little bit of historical context for John chapter 4, and we certainly won't be able to finish this and conclude it. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, as the children of Israel were entering into the promised land, taking possession, and becoming that chosen people, the Lord said that the time would come in which he would appoint them a place, an exclusive place, single place, and it would be at that place at which worship and sacrifice was to be offered and nowhere else. So Deuteronomy chapter 12 sets down for us the blueprint for understanding the Jewish mentality and the Jewish attitude toward worship, toward temple. We might say toward priesthood even. Pardon me. Allergies are bad. Anyway, now we come forward several hundred years, and we come to the death of Solomon. And upon the death of Solomon, the prophet Ahijah sought out a man by the name of Jeroboam. And he told Jeroboam that God was going to rip the kingdom from Solomon and give it to him. He was going to be king. Well, over a process of time, Solomon died. And the children of Israel obviously knew about Jeroboam. We're not given a real in-depth record of how much or exactly why they knew of him. We're not told whether or not Ahijah's message that Jeroboam would be king been spread throughout the kingdom. We're just simply not told, or at least I don't remember reading that. But nonetheless, the children of Israel gathered together, and they told Jeroboam, "You're going to be our king." So they anointed him king, and Ahijah anointed him king. Well, there was a problem. Rehoboam had been anointed as king by his father, Solomon. And so now you have two competing kings. And the issue came up. All Israel was gathered together. And the people of Israel asked Rehoboam, how do you intend to rule? Are you going to treat us fairly? Are you going to tax us exorbitantly? Exactly how are you going to be as king? And Rehoboam responded after consultation. The elders of Israel said, you need to be patient, you need to be kind, you need to be merciful, you need to be understanding, and you need to be generous with the people because your father has taxed them. They're sick and tired of it. They want some relief. They want a good leader. Well, the young men, as you know, really, really young men have a tendency to be, they were brash, they were somewhat arrogant, they were hard. Present company accepted, by the way. And so they counseled Jeroboam and said, you need to stand up in front of this people, and you need to tell them, if you think my dad was bad, you just wait. You think your taxes are bad now? I'm going to double them. I'm going to triple them. I'm being hyperbolic here, obviously. And if you think the burden that my father put on you was heavy, I'm going to double it. I'm going to make you think my dad was the greatest thing ever was, because I'll guarantee you what, I'm going to make it worse for you. Well, Jeroboam stood up along with the people who were obviously grumbling. Jeroboam said, okay, people, I've had enough. I don't know about you, but I'm out of here. And the people followed him, and the only tribes left for Rehoboam was Judah and Benjamin. That is the beginning point. Of course, this is all recorded in 1 Kings chapter 11 through 13. And so what we have here is the divided kingdom. And in 1 Kings chapter 12, Jeroboam realized that the people that had followed him when he went up to Shechem, went into what became known as the Samaritan region, he realized that they still had an attachment, an attraction, an affinity for Jerusalem, for the feast days, for the worship at Jerusalem Temple. And so, in order to prevent the children of Israel becoming once again so attracted and attached to Jerusalem and the feast days and the priesthood there, Jeroboam established a new system, a new priesthood. As a matter of fact, 1 Kings 12 tells us, the language is more than a little remarkable. It says that anyone who wanted to be king, anyone that wanted to be a priest and to serve in the worship there at Bethel and Dan and Shechem, he anointed them a priest. They didn't have to have any lineage. It didn't matter whatsoever. Hey, you want to be a priest? Come on. Do you know what to do? Nah, well, don't worry about it. We'll teach you what to do. Now, you talk about an apostasy of massive proportions. Here is an apostasy, all coming right straight back to Jeroboam and the priesthood and the worship. Well, in later years, at Mount Gerizim, the Samaritans who had been imported into the Samaritan region, when the Assyrians came in and carried the 10 northern tribes off into Assyrian captivity in 721 BC, the Samaritans established on Mount Gerizim their own independent temple. Now, we have to understand that the Samaritans were, to use an older term, they were a bunch of half-breeds. The Samaritans were never, ever considered true Jews. They were pagans that had been brought into the Samaritan region by the Assyrians. They had intermarried with the weak, the poor, the sick, etc., of the Jews that were left there or that they left there. And so in the thought of the, quote, purer Jews, unquote, the Samaritans were, they weren't even considered half-breeds, to be honest about it. The ancient Jews, the ancient rabbis, used to have a saying, or had a saying, and they said, there are three things that Yahweh hates: Gentiles, Samaritans, and women. Now, don't get me started on the women aspect of that, because I cannot explain why any rabbi would say that. But that was a saying among ancient rabbis. But that gives you an insight into the attitude of the Jews of the Judean region toward the Samaritans. And you get insight into that in John chapter 4. As Jesus was traveling to Jerusalem, and they were going to from the Samaritan region, which is where the discussion with the woman about the at the well took place, and the implications of the Messianic Temple. They were going to go through a Samaritan village, and by the way, a good faithful Jew would normally not travel through the Samaritan region. They would actually cross Jordan to the east, go south until they were parallel with Jerusalem, and then they would cross Jordan and go back into Judea. That's how much animosity there was. But when the Samaritan village knew that Jesus and his apostles were going to pass through the city, they wouldn't let them come. The Samaritans would not allow these Jews to pass through the village. So good old John, this great apostle of love, gentility, kindness, compassion, said, Lord, how about if we call fire down from heaven and just burn them all up? So that gives you some insight.
That's a big difference from that's a big difference from this kingdom's not of this world, huh?
Oh boy, oh boy. I tell you what, it's absolutely amazing. And so that's the background for when this woman says, our fathers worshipped at Gerizim. You, the Jews, say you're supposed to worship at Jerusalem. Folks, that sets up the conflict and the discussion of what Jesus said then, neither in this mountain, Gerizim, or in Jerusalem will men worship the Father, but in any place, every place. I would like to urge you to read Malachi chapter 1, verse 11. That'll be your homework for next week. In the meantime, Daniel, thanks for joining me for this evening here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Appreciate it very, very much. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.